On the floating shipless oceans, I did all my best to smile till your singing eyes and fingers drew me laughing to your eyes, and you sang, said to me, let me unfold you. Here I am, waiting to hold you. Did I dream you dreamed about me? Were you here when I was for sale? Now my foolish boat is leaning, broken love long for you sing, touch me not, come back tomorrow. Oh my heart shines from the sorrow. Well, I'm as puzzled as a newborn child. I'm as riddled as the tide. Should I stand with the breakers, or should I lie with death, my bride? Hear me sing, swim to me, let me unfold you. Here I am, waiting to hold you.
Beautiful monument, the particles that make that remind me of the dust to dust and ashes to ashes. That's our men and boys and women that gave their lives to protect you and I. And, you know, I still see their youthful faces and the excitement in their eyes as they planned on coming home to be with us. But they didn't make it. And I still feel for the Gold Star mothers and their families that never saw them again. And we are here because of them. What a great, great privilege we have today. And of the Gold Star mothers that gave their sons and daughters. But there's some of us that came home with scars and memories in our minds that we'll never forget.
That's perfect.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Well, in June of 1943, I was graduating from high school in Rochester, New York, and I had taken a test with the Army to see if I could join the Army Specialized Training Program, and I passed the test, and so they accepted me, and I went down and enlisted in the Army. Because I was 17, I couldn't go on active duty right away, so they sent me to college for one semester, and then at the end of that, I had turned 18, so that's when I went on active duty.
My name is Hank Rosen. I was a member of the 87th Division during World War II. I had met Raymond Rissler at Cornell University, where we were both in the Army Specialized Training Program prior to our permanent enlistment in the U.S. Army. I was his roommate, and I would constantly rib him about being as straight-laced, while I was more of a rapscallion.
I went on to basic training in the Army. That was down at Fort Benning, Georgia, and that was very rigorous. It was an 8-week program, and they put us through everything they had down there, from crawling under live machine gun fire to walking 50 miles with a 50-pound pack on my back, and digging a hole in the Georgia mud and sleeping in there and waking up with chigger bites all over. And we had a whole series of experiences. 9 months is a long time. We learned to live in an Army barracks. We learned what it meant to keep it clean enough to please the sergeant. So at the end of the period, it came to be October, and it was our time to ship across. And a whole bunch of us went to the 87th Division Infantry, and we had a 24-hour pass. And so in those 24 hours, I called my parents, and I went to their house, and we had a good time together, last time for quite a while. And then the next day, we got orders to board on a train, and we went up to Manhattan and onto a truck and down to one of the piers. And to our great surprise, there was the Queen Elizabeth, the first Queen Elizabeth, and that ship was going to take us across the ocean to England. And it looked huge. And they were putting our entire division on there, 18,000 men and about 300 officers and a few nurses. It was an exciting time for me, of course. I was going off into a new adventure. It was a distressing time for my parents.
Very first time I met your grandfather was at a Valentine's Day dance. And all the guys were sitting on one side and the girls were on the other. And I'm sitting there, you know, very, very, oh, wow. And I thought, there's a nice guy. And I thought, And I knew how old he was, and I knew how young I was. And so I just sort of sat and watched and watched and watched all that evening. And that's when I began to fall in love with him, because I was then 15. I just had my 15th birthday. The war was affecting so many people because if you had someone in the service, then you hung something in the window that had a red band around it and a white background, and if you had a blue star, that was an active member in the family, and if it would turn gold, that meant that they had lost them. And it was very sad. I was able to feel sad for those people, whether it was a blue star or a gold star, to think that a loved one had left to be in the service and be in the active service. We had my father and cousins and, of course, Ray in the service, and we didn't see them very often.
We were ordered to move on ahead into Germany. That campaign didn't go well. Our division, 87th Infantry Division, was the first to cross the border into Germany. We had suffered great losses in my company, which was about 300 men and 6 officers. We came back out with over 100 men lost and 3 of our 6 officers. But at the end of that period, we got orders that we were going to move north and join General Patton's Third Army. But we had an interesting experience on the way up. We stopped overnight in a little village, and my squad was in a barn, and it turned out to be a little bit before Christmas Eve. The bulge started on December 16th, and this was about December 20th. And we were in this barn, and there were cows and sheep in the barn, and we were sleeping in the hay there. And we always posted a guard outside every building that we occupied. And so I was on guard duty about midnight with another fellow, 2 at a time. And I couldn't help but think about what had happened in a barn in a haystack years before when Jesus was born. And I thought, maybe this is some kind of a signal I'm getting as to what lies ahead.
I was born in Antwerp, Belgium in 1936 and had to leave in May of 1940 because of Germany invading my country on May the 10th, 1940. And it was an event that changed my early childhood from one of having a good time, playing with kids in the park, to one where I realized early that I was living in a world that wanted me dead. There were, hundreds of thousands of refugees who were fleeing, and planes flying overhead, German planes shooting at us at treetop level with their machine guns, people dying in the street and on the road. But I do remember one incident where my mother picked me up and threw me into a ditch and covered me with her body as the German planes were flying overhead and shooting at us. I do remember that. The nightmares of planes flying overhead and crashing around me. The fear of being with people, having a great mistrust. I mean, here are people trying to kill me. And so I feared being harmed. And I could feel, the commotion going on. My gosh, we have to leave now. The Germans are coming. They're coming into France.
Meine deutsche Jugend, Nach einem Jahr kann ich euch hier wieder begrüßen. Ihr seid heute hier in dieser Muschel nur ein Ausschnitt dessen, was außer ihr über ganz Deutschland steht. Und wir möchten nun, dass ihr, deutsche Jungs und deutsche Mädchen, in euch all das aufnehmt, was wir dereinst uns von Deutschland hoffen. Wir wollen ein Volk sein. Und ihr, meine Jugend, sollt dieses Volk nun werden. Wir wollen einst keine Klassen und Stände mehr sehen. Und ihr dürft in euch schon nicht mehr groß werden lassen. Wir wollen einst ein Reich sehen. Und ihr müsst euch schon dafür erziehen. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst gehorsam ist. Und ihr müsst euch in den Gehorsam üben. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
I was born in 1929 in Bremen, Germany. I spent my childhood and my teenage years during the Second World War. I went to this school called the Gymnasium. Well, we had one Jewish kid in our class. They had to wear a certain star or whatever on their clothing that they were identified like that they were Jewish or that they were Jew. Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, I guess, where it was planned and then all over different towns or wherever, where there were Jewish establishments, stores. I personally saw that in this one town when we were traveling through. We could see the fire. We went through a town, Bamberg, and they had just destroying all the windows in the Jewish establishments.
Well, my dad was a diamond dealer, so he had some money. And the day that the Germans began to bomb Belgium, which was May 10, the bombings subsided, and my dad ran to the bank before the banks closed up and got his money out. And you can't go to a little restaurant and thinking that you're going to be served free because you were a refugee running away. Life went on, in the midst of the turmoil, life went on. We were lucky in that respect. Others couldn't afford it. And did rely on the goodness of those that did. My dad helped out all the time, That somebody needed to eat in a restaurant, didn't have any money, he would help out. And as well as others did the same thing. I mean, they were now your fellow human beings. Even though you didn't know their names, they were in the same position that you were, whether you were rich or poor.
The whole city of Rochester would go dark at the same time, just in case there happened to be an air raid. We needed to be ready for it. And so we would hear the siren, and we knew that was the time we would try to get our houses totally dark. In a way it was scary, but in another way, the war seemed to be so far away. And it was an interesting time, and everybody was very still, and it was just totally dark, which was very interesting because we were a family who loved the lightness. And so to have the house and all the streets around us all totally dark was very unique, and I must say just a little scary.
Our squad would normally have 11 men plus myself, but by that time we were down to 6 men, and we just didn't get enough replacements to fill up again. And one in particular was a young fellow who'd come on in. It was his first combat experience. And I asked him about his family. Yes, he was married, and he'd had a baby shortly before. And he showed me a picture of his baby and his wife and was so happy about that. Well, not long after that, early evening, we got under artillery fire again. And of course we did what we should do. We dug in, we got out of the woods because our German artillery had very sensitive detonators on the shells, and they'd burst in the woods when they hit a tree branch, and then all the shrapnel would shower out in a big circle. And so the thing to do was to run out in the open and dig and lay down and hope that none of them landed right where the hole was. Well, he wouldn't come out. He ran in the woods, and I called to him repeatedly, and I said, "You've got to get out of there. That's not safe. And I'm ordering you to come out. Come out of there now." He wouldn't do it. He thought he was safer in the woods. Well, after a while, he didn't answer me anymore, and a shell had come in over that way. And the next morning, what was called the death squad showed up, and they had heard that we'd lost a man, or at least one was missing. And they told me I needed to go take them to where the spot was so they could find him. And I told them I really didn't want to do that. I didn't want to see what had happened to that dear young man. But they insisted. They said that nobody else that knows where he is. You got to take me back there, take us back there. So I did, and we found him. And he was lying in the woods, and he was dead. But we couldn't find a mark on his body anywhere. And finally, one of the fellows took off his eyeglasses and found right in the corner of his eye where that little tear duct is that one of the pieces of shrapnel from the tree burst had entered into his brain, and that killed him. So they got him on their stretcher and they carried him on out. That was one of the more difficult times for me during the war.
But we got into a town called Po. So all we did was walk around town, and we didn't know what else to do. Thousands of refugees who were coming into the same area. Where else could we go, you know? We always fled away from the Nazis. And the mayor kind of got upset at all these refugees in town loitering around. So one morning, the French police came in and took us away and told us to board some buses. And they said they'd take us to some other villages where we could rest up and be on our way. You know, they took us to a camp, an internment camp, a prison camp. The men were in one part of the camp, and the women and children were in another part of the camp, and was ringed by barbed wires. They'd cover the floor with straw, and you'd sleep on that. And it was really rough. We didn't yet know what was going on. My mother was afraid that the Germans would be coming in and taking us away, and we didn't understand why the French were taking us prisoners. You know, we always thought, you know, the French were fighting the Germans, you know, and here now it was a shock to many that now they were turning against us.
Until later, about these concentration camps, we didn't know about it. Most of the German people didn't know about it. My wife's brother, he was in the Merchant Marine, and he said there was a concentration camp or a camp, and he said there were a couple kids that came to the fence, and the way he told the story was really, you know, bad. So he actually saw these people in the concentration camp.
And so in this one particular case, our mission was to take another town up ahead. And we asked about the defenses to the town. And one of the men responded and told us to look out for some large machine gun emplacements that were on the principal entry point into the town. So we determined we needed to find those, and the company commander asked Joe Schatzel, who was a good friend of mine and a platoon sergeant, to put a patrol together and go out and locate but not engage those forces that were protecting the entrance to the town. Joe selected 8 other fellows. I was one of them, and we moved on single file through the woods, and I'm talking now about snow 12 to 18 inches deep. And after about 2 miles, we came to a long valley that went down in front of us. And we saw some Germans coming up the other side of the valley. And we went down flat on our faces in the snow right then to keep an eye on them, because we were not to engage them, and we couldn't anyway. We didn't have the right kind of weapons. And they came up until they were about opposite where we were, and then they dropped out of sight. And we watched that, and pretty soon they had seemed to reappear. And Joe whispered back to us as we lay there, "We'll wait till it gets dark, and then we'll get up and get out." Well, it turned out that one of them or some of them had seen us over there, even though we were flat in the snow. And so they peeled off a small machine gun and 2 or 3 men, and they went down across the valley and got up in front of us and started firing up along where we were. The 9 of us were in a line. Joe Schatzel, the patrol leader, was first. He did not get hit. Ray Kokenauer, staff sergeant, was behind him. He got hit in the arm. I was the 3rd in the line, and realized now we're flat on the snow with our heads toward the village and our feet up the hill a little bit. And just as the fellow started firing, I felt some pressure on the back of my head. And there was no one around. I couldn't understand it, but my face was pushed down another inch or so in the snow. And immediately a bullet went through my helmet, went in the front, up above my forehead, and out the back. But it didn't graze my skin. It went above the fellows that were number 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Number 9 had a Browning automatic rifle, and he wasn't down. He was on his knees, and I think he was going to use it. And he caught that whole burst in his chest. His name was Amos Collins, 21 years old, from Philadelphia. Well, at that point, after that first burst, Joe pulled out his white handkerchief and waved it because it was evident that we were all going to be killed in another minute when the big guns across the valley opened up. So he surrendered the patrol, and the fellows made a hasty search of us, and they took everything that we had except what we were wearing and one blanket. And that included a whole bunch of new white socks my mother had sent over to me by a Red Cross parcel. And I was looking forward to wearing them, but I didn't get to do that.
At the end of February 1945, Ray's mother and father came over to our house to give us very sad news that their only child was missing in action. And that made us all very, very sad. And they didn't stay very long, just long enough pretty much to tell us that. And afterwards, of course, there were lots of tears from all of us. I could tear now. But anyway, and so the next day in school, I had Kleenex handy by, and the teachers were very understanding because they were hearing it in many of the classes were hearing about who's missing in action, who's been killed. But anyway, but that very next morning, after Ray's mother and father had been over at the house, my father came down, and he was a very positive sort of person. And he came down and he said, I want you to know that Raymond will be back because I got down on my knees last night, and when I get down on my knees, God listens, and he will be back. And but I had a teary time at school, and then of course prayers helped tremendously. But of course we didn't know for a long time what his situation was because it was at that time that he was captured. And look at me, I have tears rolling down my face. Didn't mean to make you teary, but it wasn't. Even to reminisce, it's a very teary time because when you love someone, and then your love grows tremendously, and it changes and so on, and it has a greater depth, the tears still come.
When our city was bombed, our school was kind of divided to different places. You get kind of homesick, as a young child. One of the headmasters, he was a member of the Nazi Party, and so we still had talks and indoctrinated, kind of. Must have been 10 or 12 years old. You have to join the Hitler Youth. At that time was more or less you could compare it to the Boy Scouts here. In fact, I remember the Hitler Youth. Yeah, we had a lot of activities like camping and marching through the town.
The people that first we surrendered to were combat troops, and they passed us over to some others in the town. And not everybody was still able to walk. Some of the fellows were so sick and weak that they just lay down by the side of the road, and we'd put their coats over them or whatever they had and keep on moving. And after what we hadn't had to eat, which was, you know, hardly anything, we'd had 6 or 8 men do a loaf of bread and a piece of cheese that was so smelly that some of the guys gave it away. And that was once a day. They'd tell us 6 men on the loaf today or 8 men on the loaf today, and we had to divide it up. And that was all we got all day, and some water.
So we were in this camp in end of June, beginning of July. And in 1942, when the French police began to round up the Jewish people for deportation to the death camps in Poland, there were about 1,000 or so Jews still in that camp who were deported to Auschwitz. So the question is, well, how come I'm talking to you?
I figured out that we walked about 300 miles in about 20 days, 22 days maybe. They took us into an organized prisoner of war camp. It was Stalag 12A near Limburg, and it was a huge camp. There were some 12,000 prisoners there. And that was set up with barracks in it, wooden bunks, no mattresses, just slabs of wood. And we were in there about 3 or 4 days, and surprisingly, a German officer came through and said, "There's a Red Cross person here, and they're going to give each of you a postcard, and you can write that to whoever you want, and the Red Cross will deliver it." So of course I wrote to my mother and dad and told them I was okay and where I was and not to be worried about me.
I was worried about my mother. My father was away as a soldier in the war, and my mother being alone, she was especially worried about the air raids that we had nearby. They built a nice bunker. Actually, it was not underground, it was above the ground. It was a big concrete building. In fact, it's still there. I got home when I was about 14. We were sent again away to another place in Germany. And we were there when Dresden was bombed and burned. And I remember the people that got away, just walking towards the town we stayed in, just the way they were, in pajamas or whatever. But they walked in there, well, they were safe. And we put them up, we directed them to where they can get help, and that was part of our job.
We sometimes came to small towns that had been bombed the night before by the Allies. And in those cases, they put us to work, and we were required to work under their command. And the work that I was involved with was digging in the rubble of homes to try to find if there were any survivors that were buried in there. And another fellow and I were working in the same house, and sure enough, before long, we found a woman's arm, appeared to be, and we cleared her all off, and it was a very elderly lady, and she was unconscious, but she was not dead. So we got her up out of there, and we made a kind of a litter, and another buddy and I carried her down into the town where there was a hospital. And as soon as we got to the hospital, we could see the place was overflowing because the town had just been bombed the night before. We took her into the building and immediately saw that there were people lying on the floor in the corridors. So we laid her down and went off to find a doctor, and I found a doctor who spoke English. And I told him that we had just found a woman out in the rubble and she needed attention right away, and he said, "I'll come look." So he walked with me over there, and he got down on his knee and he listened to her and he looked at her and he said, "She's alive, but not for long, and I can't spend any time with her. I have young people to save."
My brother Sammy, he escaped from the camp at 16 years old, and walked far enough away from the camp to hitchhike a ride into a nearby town, where he was trying to find out how he could get his family out of the camp. So Sammy found this mayor, village mayor, who told him that he and his family could stay in his town. So Sammy, through another French official, with the help of another French official, went back to the camp with a document from that French official authorizing the commander of the camp to release his family. I remember when we were released, we were near the commander's office, sitting on the ground, and there were sentry soldiers walking back and forth with rifle in hand. And I was getting afraid of that, you know. Were they going to shoot me? And when I was sitting next to my mom, and she told me not to worry about it, that we're just waiting for some transportation to ride out of the camp. And so we did get an army truck that drove us out and dropped us off at a small village. So that was quite a feat, my brother did. 16 years old. Wow.
A few weeks I was home, not too long then. I got a notice that they want me in the Volkssturm, in the People's Army, which is part of the German army, but they recruited all the young people that were 15 or 16 years old. I had to report to a certain place. Well, they give you a pistol, here, go. And you were supposed to fight. But I was fortunate enough that where I reported, the commander told us, "Boys, go home." We did. But some of my other classmates were not as fortunate, and they were actually taken prisoner of war.
There was one particular incident that affected me, and I think about it often. During one of our advances down a particular road, off in the slight distance, there was an open field and there was a village. All of a sudden, we noticed a group of soldiers coming toward us from that village. In actuality, they turned out to be 14-year-olds that the Germans had recruited as extra soldiers. They had no idea how close they were to us. And as they came toward us, the entire group of us opened fire and actually mowed them down. And we could hear them crying, the survivors, we could hear crying in the field. A group of our men went out and took about perhaps 20 prisoners who were still alive. About 5 minutes later, a soldier came upon us and asked who would like to kill some prisoners. Of course, no one in our vicinity volunteered for this. He went back, and about 10 minutes later, we heard the sound of German machine gun fire. They were using their own machine guns to kill them. And that affected me very emotionally. And to this day, I think of what an awful thing it was to kill these 14-year-old kids.
The city was free, but when Hitler came, it was a little more restricted. And the people in our town didn't like that. I only remember once that he came. See, Bremen also was a shipbuilding, so he was christening a ship. I think that's the only time, and something happened. They threw stuff at him.
So we went to the train station in Nice, and it was filled with French police roaming around. And there were people in the waiting area. I saw a man crying, sobbing. So we got on the train. Leo and I were in one car, and my mom and dad were in another car. We were accompanied by my father's twin brother, Emile, who was a French citizen. And on the way up, Leo and I were having a conversation about our parents. It was really interesting, whether we would ever see them again. So we all got off at a train, at a stop in a French Alpine village, not too far away from Switzerland, because our goal was to cross into Switzerland, escape there. My uncle and Leo and I got off first and started to walk out, and all of a sudden 2 French policemen stop us and asked my uncle, "Where are you going?" And he had a suitcase with him, and he said to them, "Well, these are my children. I'm going on vacation." And then my parents followed, and they let them go. And then all of a sudden, the 2 policemen started running after us. My uncle, my brother, and I. And they stopped us and asked my uncle whether he knew those people, meaning my parents. And he said, "No." He said, "Well, The reason why we ask is the woman's passport, which was a false passport, had her maiden name as Gross. The forger made an almost fatal error. And of course, my uncle's last name was Gross. So they put the two together, and he said, no, I don't know them. And then they started looking for my parents. And by the time they were looking for my parents, they saw what was going on, my parents, and they ran into a bar. And were hidden out for a few minutes by a bunch of farmers who were taking their afternoon drinks. Couldn't find them. The police couldn't find them, so they went back to their station.
And the very next day, they told us they were going to start evacuating the camp because the front was getting closer, the battlefront. And there was a railroad track inside the camp, and I was one of the ones that was going to go out on the first train. And then I looked at the top of the train, which I could see as we walked toward it, and it was not marked POW for prisoner of war, which was supposed to be the case if they transported people. But they put us on board anyway. The second or third day that we were in the train, we heard aircraft. And it turned out to be 4 American aircraft, fighter bombers that were flying in over the area. Well, we thought we were really going to be in for it now because this train isn't marked. But it turned out that the sharp-eyed pilot spotted another train in the same valley up against the mountainside, all covered with live evergreen trees that they had cut to camouflage it. And so they figured out quickly that that would be the more valuable cargo, so they went over and they dropped, fortunately, all 8 of their wing bombs, 2 per plane. They dropped them all on that train. Then they turned their attention to our train. And they didn't have any more wing bombs, but they had machine guns in the planes. And so we figured we were going to get strafed. And sure enough, they started to fire at the train that we were in. And they hit a car here and a car here and another one there and another one down there. And my car did not get hit. And the planes circled around then and came back, and they repeated that run. And the second time, my car did not get hit, but plenty of others did. And they were just circling to make a third run when all of a sudden the railroad car slid open, which amazed us because we'd seen the guards run away. But there was another prisoner standing there, and he said, "Get out fast and take off your shirts." And we all went out in the field, and like we had rehearsed it, which we had not or even talked about it, we all pulled off our shirts so our bare backs showed, and we lay down on the grass and we spelled out the great giant letters POW with our bare backs up. And of course the planes saw that when they came on the third run, and they didn't fire anymore. There were over 300 casualties in that strafing.
Ray's mother had a dream, and I know that. She had a dream, and she heard him calling her. And I don't think it lasted very long, but just to hear him calling her, she knew he would be alive and he'd be all right. And she always said that he would be back. She never questioned that for a minute. But his father, he just couldn't stand the thought of losing his only child. And that was a difficult time to see his father so sad, because his mother was a very positive lady, but he didn't even go to work for a little while. But it all ended happily, and that was the plus time. But I was still loving him all that time.
The next morning turned out to be Palm Sunday, and we didn't know that, hadn't kept track of it, didn't know what day it was. But the Anglican priest knew that, and he collected a group of Red Cross parcels and made an altar, and he had brought a cross and a Bible along, and he held a marvelous Palm Sunday service right out there in the field. And everybody gathered around, sat down and listened, including the guards. And he, of course, was talking about biblical stories about people who were escaping and got saved, and he said, "You're all escaping, and soon you're going to get saved, and believe that." It was a wonderful sermon. Well, he was right. About a week later, we were in a little town, and we heard tanks, and got out and looked and found out that they were American tanks, and it was outside the city of Gießen. The mayor had surrendered the town. He didn't want it destroyed, and he had big white sheets hanging out of the church steeples. So there was no gunfire, and before long we were back in Allied hands, and that was a great day to celebrate.
And then all of a sudden we heard a voice, "Halt," in German. And we thought it was, the Nazis. And it was a Swiss border guard. And we got to the border, and he told us that he would only allow people into the country if they had a relative living in Switzerland. I mean, what are the odds of that, really? And my mother's mother lived in Switzerland. So we were in a displaced persons camp, and Leo and I were only there for about 3 months, until around January or February of '43. And we were given the opportunity to live with some foster families who wanted to take care of the children who were in the camp. And my mother agreed to that. So Leo lived with a foster family in one town, and I lived with a foster family in another town. So the family was separated. And I lived, unfortunately, in a family, and they were a nice family, especially the father was very nice to me. But they had a son a little older than me who abused me. He was jealous of me and really gave me a rough time until I rejoined my parents, who were released at the end of 1943, and lived with my grandmother in her apartment. And so I reunited with them in, I think, February of '44. So I was separated from my mother over a year, and were able to get visas from my father's relatives who lived in New York City to come to America. And we came here in April of '46. It was a tough adjustment, especially for my parents. They never really adjusted well.
I guess it's hard to recall the emotionals. I had a brother. He was older, about 4 years older than I am. And he maybe kind of in favor of the Hitler regime at first, but he changed his mind. Well, he was drafted. The German army was different from the Nazi party, more or less. You know, there are a lot of high-ranking officers in the German army that were against the whole thing. I still have a couple letters of his while he was going on his way to the front lines.
The three brothers talking about their experiences. We never talked about it. So Sammy remembered, but he didn't want to talk about it. And it took a little bit of coaxing. And at one point he did mention his escape from the camp. And he told the story. And Leo turned to him, put his arm around him, and said to Sammy, "You know, I never thanked you for saving my life."
I took it pretty hard, actually, when my brother died, was killed. See, each soldier, as you know, as it is here and was over there, you have a dog tag, you call it, you know. And they usually send it back, or some personal belongings, you know what you have, they send it back to the parents. But we didn't get anything back. There's no record in any of the cemeteries. Just recently, I got the letter out again from my brother. Well, you know, after a while, things got better, and
if it weren't for the Americans, we would be all under the Nazi web. So I'm grateful for all of them.
When I was at home, we had mail delivery to our door in my parents' home in Rochester. One morning when I was in there talking to Mom, the mailman came, and I said, "I'll go out and see him." And he handed me 2 or 3 pieces of mail, and one of them was the card that I had written to them months earlier, and the Red Cross had finally delivered it. So he handed me back the same card I had written that they hadn't seen yet.
Yes, we still and are even more in love than we were 61 and a half years ago. It's a journey that you're taking together, and it has to be, you have to be very serious about it, and you want to make it such a special relationship, one that will have love as long, and Ray and I do talk about the time that one of us will have to go. And we don't like to think about it, but it's reality. And we can't imagine it. But that's when your faith kicks in and God will walk with you through those times.
I can't deny God. Because, you know, when the Jewish people were walking toward their death at the death camps and into the gas chambers, they were chanting prayers to God. Still believing in God, even though they knew that a few minutes later they would be dead. If their belief in God was so strong, I felt it would be a betrayal on my part not to believe in God.
I'll tell you, I grew up a lot. I learned a lot about people. I saw people behaving at their worst under stress and people behaving at their best under stress. And I came to understand that different people react to problems in very different kind of ways. And I've told a lot of people it was a great experience. I'm not sorry it happened, but I wouldn't want to do it again.
So I have 4 sons and 5 grandchildren. And I think about, when I talk about that, I think about the 1.5 million children who never made it out of the Holocaust, Jewish children. And if they had been alive, how many more grandparents and parents and children and grandchildren there would have been? How many celebrations and birthdays and wedding anniversaries and other celebrations. So I'm fortunate. When I lived in Switzerland with my foster family, one day my foster mother asked me whether I wanted to plant a sunflower. So I did, and it worked. And that sunflower, weeks later on, I get up in the morning and I see that sunflower almost as about 10 feet tall. And I was just amazed at it. And I looked at that sunflower for a long time. I wish I had taken a picture of it, but the picture is in my mind, and it always will be in my mind. That was an important moment for me. It felt like I was crossing the bridge from despair to hope. It really meant a lot to me. And that's why you see we have sunflowers in this house.